I do not know how long I have been here. That is the first thing you should understand about this place, about what I am about to tell you. Time does not behave in the warp. It does not flow. It does not pass. It pools and eddies, and sometimes it runs backward like blood returning to a wound. And sometimes it freezes entirely so that a single moment stretches across what might be years, and sometimes it simply stops existing altogether. I have tried to count. I have tried to mark the passage of something, anything, on the walls of my chamber. The marks keep changing. They multiply when I am not looking. They arrange themselves into patterns that hurt to see. So, I stopped counting. I stopped trying to measure, and now I simply exist in this place, in this state, and I tell you what I know, because if I do not speak, if I do not give voice to what has happened, then I will finally lose the last tattered remnant of the thing I used to call Marcus Reeve. I was a logistics coordinator aboard the Emperor's Burden, a bulk transport hauling processed grains and preserved proteins from the agri-world of Thessaly Prime to the hive cities of Meridian. 17,000 souls crewed that vessel. I knew perhaps 300 of them by name. I worked in Section Gamma 7, deep in the ship's middle decks, surrounded by cogitators and data slates, and the constant hum of machines calculating cargo weights, fuel consumption, route efficiency. It was boring work, sacred work. The ecclesiarchy representatives always reminded us. The Emperor's hunger must be fed. The tithes must flow. We were the blood vessels of the Imperium, carrying nourishment to its starving organs. I believed that. Once, I believed in the importance of what we did, in the honor of service, in the protection of the Geller field and the guidance of the Astronomicon. I believed the warp was something we passed through, not something that could reach inside and take. The Emperor's Burden had made the journey from Thessaly Prime to Meridian 47 times without incident. I know because I maintained those records myself. 47 successful translations, each one lasting between 6 and 8 days in real space equivalent. The warp was calm along that route. The navigator, a withered woman named Castella, whose third eye wept constantly, called it a gentle current. She said the Emperor's light shone bright there, that the predators of the Immaterium kept their distance. She was wrong about that. Or perhaps she was right. And what happened to us was not predation at all, but something worse, something we did to ourselves. I remember the moment of translation, not the violent lurch of entering the warp, which I had experienced dozens of times before, but a specific moment during the journey when something changed. I was in my quarters, a narrow cell barely wide enough for my cot and personal effects, reviewing manifests on a data slate. The numbers blurred. At first I thought it was fatigue, my eyes failing after too many hours of work. Then I realized the numbers were not blurring but moving, rearranging themselves on the screen, forming patterns that were not words and not symbols and not anything my mind could process. I blinked, and the data slate was dark. I blinked again, and it was gone entirely, vanished from my hands as if it had never existed. The lights in my chamber flickered, stuttered, died. And in the darkness, I heard something I should not have been able to hear through the thick metal walls of the ship. I heard the warp breathing. That was when the screaming started. The corridors of the Emperor's Burden were cramped arteries of metal and conduit, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. I know this because I ran through them, past shrieking crew members whose faces had begun to change, past walls that bled colors I had no names for, past viewports that showed not the swirling madness of warp transit, but something else, something that looked back. I ran toward the bridge because that was what the emergency protocols demanded. I ran toward Navigator Castella because she was supposed to guide us, protect us, bring us home. I never reached the bridge. The corridors shifted while I ran. Hallways that should have led upward curved downward. Stairs that I had climbed 1,000 times deposited me back where I started. And everywhere, always, the sound of the ship screaming, metal groaning, voices crying out in languages that were not human. I found refuge in a storage bay. I do not remember which one. The door sealed behind me, and the sounds grew muffled, and I pressed myself into a corner between crates of preserved grain, and I wept like a child. I prayed, Emperor of mankind, Father of humanity, guide your servant through this darkness. Protect me from the predations of the unreal. Let your light be my shield. The words tasted like ash. They fell from my lips and dissolved before they could reach whatever distant golden throne they were intended for. And somewhere in the storage bay, among the neatly stacked crates that represented my entire purpose, something began to laugh. I did not see the entity that laughed. I do not know if it had a form, or if it was simply the warp itself mocking my prayers. But I heard it, felt it, knew it was watching me with something that was not eyes, considering me with something that was not a mind. The laughter went on for what might have been hours. Then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard a voice I recognized. Marcus. It was Delilah Chen, from Section Gamma 7. We had worked together for 3 years. She had a laugh like wind chimes, a habit of humming while she worked, a small tattoo of a butterfly on her left wrist that she said reminded her of a home she would never see again. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves, from the grain in the crates, from inside my own skull. Marcus, where are you? I cannot find you. Marcus, please, I am so scared. I called out to her. I stumbled through the storage bay, shoving crates aside, searching for the source of her voice. It led me deeper into the bay, past rows of cargo I did not remember, past containers marked with symbols that burned to look at, until I found a door that should not have been there. A metal door, ancient and rusted, set into the bulkhead where no door had ever been. Delilah's voice came from behind it. Marcus, please, open the door. I am so alone in here. I reached for the handle. Something stopped me. Some final fragment of sanity, some whispered warning from the depths of my training, from the half-remembered sermons about the nature of the warp and its lies. I pulled my hand back, and I ran. I ran from the door, from the voice, from the thing that wore Delilah Chen's words like a mask. Behind me, I heard her calling my name, and her voice grew less and less like hers with each repetition, until it was something wet and hungry and laughing again. That was the first time I encountered the door. It would not be the last. I found other survivors in the days that followed, or what I believed were days. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Cross, a weapons officer with a scarred face and trembling hands, Ensign Patricia Muller, barely more than a child, assigned to the ship as her first posting, Tech Adept Silas Vance, a junior engineer whose mechanical limbs clicked and whirred in patterns that seemed almost like prayer, Father Josiah Crane, a missionary returning to Meridian to spread the Emperor's word among the hive-born masses. We gathered in the ship's chapel, a small chamber of brass and flickering candles, because Father Crane insisted the Emperor's presence would be strongest there. He was wrong about that too. The ship had changed around us. Corridors that once led somewhere now led nowhere, or everywhere, or to places that could not exist within the vessel's original architecture. The bridge was gone, swallowed by a darkness that moved and hungered. The engine decks had become a labyrinth of screaming machinery. Turbines and reactors fused into shapes that suggested faces, organs, mouths. The crew was gone, all 17,000 of them, absorbed or transformed or simply erased from existence. Only the 5 of us remained, huddled in the chapel, trying to make sense of what had happened. Cross wanted to find the navigator. He believed Castella could still guide us out, could still find the Emperor's light and steer us back to reality. Muller wanted to reach the savior pods, to launch ourselves into the warp and pray for rescue. Vance wanted to repair the Jella field, convinced that the protective barrier had simply failed and could be restored. Crane wanted to pray, endlessly, fervently, his voice rising and falling in hymns that seemed to irritate something in the walls. I wanted to survive. I did not know how. I only knew that the door I had found, the door with Delilah's voice behind it, was important somehow. It had appeared where no door should be. It had called to me by name. And even as I sat in the chapel, listening to Cross argue with Vance about engineering protocols, I could feel it waiting for me somewhere in the ship's twisted bowels. The first of us to disappear was Muller. We had been in the chapel for what might have been 2 days, rationing the emergency supplies Vance had salvaged from a storage compartment that still connected to reality. Muller had gone to relieve herself in a maintenance corridor just outside the chapel, and she had not returned. We found her uniform in the corridor, neatly folded, still warm. We found her shoes, positioned as if she had simply stepped out of them. We found her rosary beads, the ones she had clutched constantly since we gathered, arranged in a perfect circle around her abandoned clothing. We did not find Muller. When Cross called her name into the darkness of the corridor, something called back, but it was not her voice, and we sealed the chapel doors and did not call out again. Father Crane died next, though I suppose died is not the correct word. He was praying at the chapel's modest altar, a brass aquila surrounded by votive candles. When the altar opened, that is the only way I can describe it. The metal split along seams that had not existed, and something reached up from beneath, and Crane had time to scream exactly once before he was pulled down into a space that could not have fit beneath the deck plates. The altar closed behind him. The candles continued to flicker as if nothing had happened. Cross demanded we leave the chapel immediately. Vance argued that the chapel was still the safest place, that the Emperor's symbols still held some power. They were still arguing when I noticed the door. It was in the corner of the chapel, where the wall met the ceiling, hanging at an angle that defied geometry. The same door, the same ancient rust, the same wrongness, and behind it I could hear Delilah's voice again, and Muller's voice, and Crane's voice, all calling my name, all begging me to open the door and join them. Marcus, Marcus, we miss you, Marcus. It is beautiful here. I told Cross and Vance about the door. Cross said he could not see it. Vance said the wall was solid metal. They looked at me with expressions I recognized, the careful wariness reserved for those who have begun to break. But I could see the door. I could feel it pulling at something inside me, a hook in my chest, a thread connecting me to whatever waited on the other side. And for the first time, I wondered if I was the only one seeing the truth, or the only one far gone enough to see the lie. Cross disappeared during what might have been our 3rd night in the chapel. We had taken turns keeping watch, though what we were watching for, none of us could say. I woke from a sleep filled with dreams of doors and voices to find Vance standing over Cross's empty bedroll, his mechanical fingers clenched into fists. Cross was gone. No clothing left behind this time. No personal effects. Just an absence. A void where a man had been. The chapel felt smaller than before. The walls closer. The ceiling lower. The door in the corner had grown. It now occupied an entire section of wall. Its rusty surface, pulsing faintly with something that might have been a heartbeat. "Do you see it now?" I asked Vance. "Do you see the door?" Vance was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to me, and his eyes, the organic ones that remained above his respirator mask, were wet with tears. "I have always seen it," he said. "It has been following me since I was a child." We spoke then, Vance and I, in the chapel that had become our prison. He told me about his childhood on a forge world, about the nightmares that had plagued him since adolescence, about the door that appeared in the corners of rooms whenever he was alone. He had joined the Mechanicus to escape it, had replaced his flesh with metal, hoping to become something it could not follow. But the door had followed him anyway, across worlds and years, and the vast black gulfs between stars. And now, in the warp, it had finally caught up. I told him about Delilah's voice, about the storage bay where I had first found the door, about the pull I felt, the thread connecting me to whatever waited on the other side. Vance listened with the patience of a machine, his mechanical components clicking softly in what I had come to recognize as his version of thoughtful silence. "The warp shows us what we fear most," he said finally. "But it also shows us what we want most. The door is not just a trap. It is a promise. It is offering us something." "What?" I asked. "What could it possibly offer?" Vance's mechanical fingers twitched. "An end to fear," he said. "An end to running. A place where we finally belong." He walked toward the door before I could stop him. His metal limbs carried him with steady purpose, his respirator hissing with each breath. He reached for the handle, a rusted iron ring that seemed to pulse with anticipation. I called his name, but my voice emerged as a whisper, stolen by the chapel's hungry air. Vance turned back to me, and his organic eyes were calm. "I am tired, Marcus," he said. "I have been running for so long." He opened the door. What I saw behind it defies language. It was not darkness, and it was not light. It was not space, and it was not emptiness. It was a color that does not exist, a sound that was also a smell, that was also a texture, that was also a thought. It reached out and wrapped around Vance like a lover's embrace. And I saw his mechanical components begin to change, to flow, to merge with the whatever it was that welcomed him home. His face, the last organic part of him visible, wore an expression of perfect peace. Then the door closed, and I was alone. I do not know how long I remained in the chapel after Vance disappeared. Time had lost all meaning. The candles burned without consuming themselves. The aquila on the altar began to tarnish, then corrode, then twist into shapes that hurt to see. The walls breathed, the floor pulsed. The door in the corner grew larger. With each moment I did not look at it, and the voices behind it multiplied. Delilah and Muller and Crane and Cross and Vance, all calling my name, all promising me rest. I left the chapel because the chapel was no longer the chapel. It had become something else, a throat, a gullet, a digestive system designed for souls rather than flesh. I crawled through corridors that had become tunnels of meat and metal fused together, past walls that showed faces pressing from the other side, past viewports that opened onto scenes from my own memories twisted into nightmares. I saw my childhood home on the industrial moon where I was born, but the sky above it was made of screaming mouths. I saw my mother's face, but her eyes were doors, and something looked out through them. I saw myself, standing at the end of a corridor, beckoning me forward, and when I approached, the other Marcus opened his mouth, and the inside of his throat was the warp itself, infinite and hungry. The ship was no longer a ship. The Emperor's burden had become something alive, something aware, something that knew my name and my fears and my hopes, and fed on all of them equally. I wandered through its intestines for what might have been days or weeks or centuries, finding new horrors in every chamber, in every passage, in every moment of apparent safety that dissolved into fresh terror. I found crew members fused into the walls, their mouths still moving in silent screams. I found servitors whose biological components had begun to grow, tumors of flesh spreading across mechanical frames. I found the bridge, or what remained of it, a vast cavity at the ship's heart, where the captain's throne had become an altar to something that demanded worship I could not give. And always, everywhere, the door. It appeared in corridors I had already passed through. It materialized in chambers I had thought were safe. It opened in the floors beneath my feet and the ceilings above my head, offering glimpses of that color that was not a color, that sound that was also a smell that was also the promise of oblivion. The voices behind it grew more numerous, more insistent, more familiar. I heard my mother. I heard friends I had lost decades ago. I heard my own voice, speaking words I did not remember saying, promising me that everything would be better if I just opened the door. I began to wonder why I was fighting it. Everyone else had given in. Everyone else had found their peace, their rest, their end to running. Why did I keep walking through these impossible corridors, keep breathing this poisoned air, keep existing in this hell between realities? What was I holding on to? What was I trying to preserve? The answer came to me in a chamber that had once been the ship's medical bay. The surgical tables had grown legs and wandered the room like confused animals. The medical cogitators screamed diagnoses in languages that predated humanity. The apothecary cabinets had become mouths, their shelves transformed into rows of teeth that chattered endlessly. And in the center of the room, hanging from chains that descended from a ceiling lost in darkness, was Navigator Castella. She was still alive, if you could call it life. Her body had been stretched, elongated, her limbs pulled to impossible lengths, her torso attenuated until she was more serpent than woman. Her third eye, the navigator's eye that had guided us through so many successful translations, had grown to occupy most of her face, a massive orb of witch sight that wept tears of silver fire. Her mouth moved constantly, though no sound emerged, and her hands, her elongated fingers with their too many joints, traced patterns in the air that made reality itself shudder. She saw me. Her massive eye focused on me with terrible intensity, and I felt her mind touch mine, a brush of consciousness that carried with it visions I will never be able to forget. I saw what had happened to the Emperor's burden. I saw the moment the Geller field had flickered, not failed but flickered, just for an instant, just long enough for something to notice us, something vast, something patient, something that had been waiting in the warp for 10,000 years for exactly this opportunity. The entity had not attacked us. It had not needed to. It had simply reached into our ship, into our minds, and planted a single seed, the door. The door was not a door. It was an invitation, a contract, a transaction. The entity that had touched us fed on isolation, on loneliness, on the desperate need to belong somewhere, anywhere. It found the empty places inside us, the voids where connection should have been, and it offered to fill them. The door was the way in. The door was the price of admission. Behind the door was a realm where the entity dwelt, where all the lonely souls it had collected across millennia existed in eternal communion, bound together in a unity that transcended individual existence. It was not torment the entity offered. It was not damnation. It was love, a terrible, consuming, annihilating love that would dissolve everything you were and remake you as part of something infinitely larger, infinitely older, infinitely more alone than any individual could ever be. Castella showed me this in the space between heartbeats. She showed me the crew of the Emperor's burden joining the entity one by one, drawn to their personal doors by promises tailored to their specific loneliness. She showed me Delilah Chen, stepping through to find the family she had lost. She showed me Father Crane, passing through to meet the god he had spent his life seeking. She showed me Vance, merging with a unity that finally replaced the connections his mechanical body had cost him. They were all still there, still conscious, still themselves in some fundamental way, but they were also part of something else now, part of the entity, part of its endless hunger for companionship. And she showed me myself. She showed me what the entity saw when it looked at me, a man who had spent his entire life maintaining records, tracking cargo, ensuring the efficient flow of materials from one place to another, all while remaining utterly disconnected from the people around him. A man who knew 300 names but had no friends. A man who served the Imperium with perfect dedication and perfect emptiness. A man who was already so alone that the entity's offer barely registered as a change. The door was meant for me more than anyone. The door had been calling to me since before the Geller field flickered. The door was my door, had always been my door, would always be my door, waiting in the corners of rooms and the edges of realities until I finally accepted what it offered. Castella's mind released mine, and I fell to my knees on the living floor of the medical bay. Her massive eye continued to weep silver fire. Her stretched body swayed in the chains, and her mouth finally produced sound, a whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber. "You can still choose," she said. "The door will always be there. But you can still choose." "Why are you still here?" I asked. "Why have you not gone through?" "Because I can see what is on the other side," she said, "and I have seen enough. My eye shows me everything, Marcus. Everything the entity is, everything it wants, everything it will become. And I would rather hang in these chains forever than join that." "What will you do?" "What I must." Castella's stretched face attempted something like a smile. "There is still a way out. Not through the door, but around it. Through. The warp is not just the entity's realm. There are currents here that even it cannot control. Paths between the paths. If someone were to navigate those currents, They might find their way back to reality. You can do that. I can see the way, but I cannot walk it. Her elongated hand gestured at her distorted body, at the chains that held her suspended. I am bound here now, anchored. The entity keeps me as a prize, a navigator's eye to add to its collection. But you are still free, Marcus. You have not opened the door. You can still move. I do not know the way. Then let me show you. She reached out with her impossible arm, her fingers stretching across the chamber to touch my forehead, and in that touch I received a map. Not a map of space, because space did not exist here. A map of something else. Emotions, intentions, states of being. A route through the Immaterium that followed fear and hope and rage and grief, that navigated by the intensity of feeling rather than the distance between points. I saw the path she had charted for me, a treacherous route through the warp's psychic geography, and I understood what she was asking me to do. I would have to feel my way out. I would have to experience every emotion the warp could throw at me, traverse the territories of gods and demons and things that defied categorization, all while the entity pursued me, all while the door continued to appear, all while the voices of everyone I had ever known begged me to stop and rest and finally come home. It was not escape she was offering me. It was ordeal. Why should I do this? I asked. Why not simply open the door and end it? Because, Castella said, her massive eye boring into mine, the entity has been alone for 10,000 years. It has consumed millions of souls, and it is still alone. Its communion is not connection. Its love is not love. It is a parasite pretending to be a symbiont, and everyone it takes becomes part of its loneliness rather than part of something real. If you go through that door, you will not find peace. You will find an eternity of need that can never be satisfied, and you will help it spread that need to others. She released my forehead, her arm retracting to its distended length. I showed you because you asked, she said, but I will not force you. The door is still there. It will always be there. Choose. I looked at the door. It had appeared in the medical bay while Castella spoke, manifesting in a corner near a cabinet of chattering teeth. The voices behind it had grown quiet, respectful, as if understanding that the moment of decision had finally arrived. I could feel the entity's attention focused on me with terrible intensity, waiting, hoping, hungering for my choice. I thought about Delilah Chen and her wind chime laugh. I thought about Vance and his patient mechanical clicking. I thought about 17,000 souls who had crewed the Emperor's burden, all of them now part of something that was not salvation and not damnation but something worse, something in between, something that offered everything while providing nothing. I thought about Marcus Reeve, logistics coordinator, keeper of records, counter of cargo, a man so alone that an ancient entity of the warp had marked him as a prize. And I chose. I turned away from the door. I faced the medical bay's entrance, a sphincter of meat and metal that pulsed with reluctant life. I took a step toward it, then another, following the map Castella had burned into my mind. Behind me, the door opened. The color that was not a color poured out, washing over my back like a wave of longing so intense it brought me to my knees. The voices called my name, all of them at once, a chorus of everyone I had ever known and everyone I had ever wanted to know, promising connection, community, belonging. The entity reached for me with limbs made of absence, trying to pull me back, trying to embrace me, trying to show me that I did not need to keep running, that I did not need to be alone anymore. I crawled forward. My hands and knees tore on the floor's organic surface, leaving trails of blood that the ship absorbed hungrily. The entity's pull intensified, grief and loneliness and desperate need flooding through me in waves that made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter. I thought about giving up. I thought about how easy it would be to simply stop moving, to let the entity take me, to finally rest after a lifetime of empty purpose. But I thought, too, about Castella hanging in her chains, her eye weeping fire, her navigator's sight showing her eternities of horror, and still refusing to yield. If she could resist, bound and broken and alone, then so could I. I reached the sphincter door. I forced my way through its reluctant opening, my body slick with fluids I did not want to identify. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of screaming faces, each one someone I had known, each one begging me to come back. I followed the map in my mind, turning left where the fear was strongest, straight ahead where the anger peaked, right where the grief threatened to swallow me entirely. The entity pursued me. I could feel it moving through the ship, rearranging corridors, closing paths, trying to force me back toward the door. But Castella's map held true. The emotions I followed were too fundamental, too deeply woven into the warp's fabric, for even the entity to fully control. I navigated by heartbreak and terror and rage, moving through spaces that had never been part of any ship, passing through experiences rather than locations. I cannot describe that journey in terms that will make sense. I walked through a corridor of my father's disappointment, each step weighted with his unspoken expectations. I crawled through a chamber of childhood loneliness, surrounded by the ghosts of friends I had never managed to make. I swam through a sea of professional failure, every rejected application and missed promotion pressing against me like water pressure, threatening to crush my chest. The warp showed me everything I had ever feared about myself, everything I had ever hated, everything I had spent my life running from. And always, the door appeared. In corners, in ceilings, in the faces of memory ghosts who opened their mouths and showed me that color that was not a color. The entity adapted its offers, promised me specific solutions to specific wounds. Behind this door you will find your father's approval. Behind this door you will find the friends you never had. Behind this door you will find meaning, purpose, connection, love. Behind this door you will find everything you have spent your life pretending you did not need. I kept walking. The map led me deeper into places that had no names, through territories claimed by intelligences that made the entity seem like a minor predator. I passed through a realm of crystallized rage, where every surface cut like glass, and the air itself burned with ancient fury. I crossed a desert of apathy where walking required more effort than I had ever known, where simply caring enough to take another step felt like lifting mountains. I descended into an abyss of grief, so profound that I forgot, for a time, that I had ever known anything else. In that abyss, I found something unexpected, a light. Not the golden radiance of the Astronomicon, not the Emperor's holy beacon that guides ships through the warp. This was something smaller, dimmer, more personal, a single point of illumination in the infinite dark, flickering like a candle flame in a hurricane. I moved toward it because the map told me to. I moved toward it because I had nowhere else to go. And when I reached it, I found that the light was coming from inside my own chest, from a place I had thought was empty, from the very loneliness the entity had tried to exploit. The light was my refusal to surrender. I had spent my life alone because I had never learned how to be any other way. I had maintained records and counted cargo because those were tasks that required no connection, no vulnerability, no risk of rejection. I had memorized 300 names without making a single friend because friendship required giving something I had convinced myself I did not have. But in this place, in this moment, surrounded by the warp's infinite horrors, I discovered that my isolation was not a wound but a choice, and choices could be changed. The entity had offered me communion as a substitute for the connections I had failed to make. But communion was not connection. Absorption was not intimacy. The unity it promised was just another form of loneliness, magnified to cosmic proportions, shared among millions of absorbed souls who had each believed they were finally finding what they needed. I did not need what the entity offered. I did not need false communion or parasitic love or the dissolution of self into something larger. I needed to learn how to be lonely in a different way. I needed to learn how to be alone with myself, instead of empty without others. The light in my chest grew brighter as I understood this. It pushed back against the abyss, carved a space in the grief, created a bubble of something that might almost have been peace. And in that bubble, I saw the final waypoint on Castella's map, a tear in the warp, a wound in unreality, a place where the Immaterium grew thin enough for a single soul to slip through. I walked toward it, The entity screamed behind me, its voice no longer seductive but furious. A child denied a toy it had already claimed as its own. Doors appeared everywhere, dozens of them, hundreds, each one opening onto that impossible color, each one howling with voices that demanded I return. The warp itself seemed to twist against me, trying to close the path, trying to seal the wound before I could reach it. But I was not navigating by the warp's rules anymore. I was navigating by my own, following the light in my chest, walking towards something that had nothing to do with the entity, or its promises, or its endless hunger. I was walking toward the possibility of being alone in a way that might, someday, leave room for being something else. I reached the tear. It was barely visible, a slight ripple in the fabric of unreality, easily mistaken for just another illusion in a realm made entirely of lies. But I could feel the difference through the wound, could sense the hard edges of real space pressing against the Immaterium's soft chaos. I could smell, impossibly, recycled air and ozone, and the particular mustiness of a void ship's ventilation system. I pushed through. The pain was indescribable. The warp does not give up its prizes easily, and passage through that tear required leaving parts of myself behind. I lost memories. I lost certainties. I lost something fundamental in my sense of who and what I was. The entity made one final grab for me, its limbs of absence wrapping around my ankles, my waist, my throat, trying to drag me back into the communion it had prepared for me. But I was already gone. I fell out of the warp, onto a cold metal deck, gasping air that tasted like recycled sweat and sacred machine oil. Alarms blared around me. Voices shouted in Imperial Gothic, demanding identification, threatening violence. Hands grabbed me, dragged me upright, slammed me against a bulkhead while weapons hummed with barely contained lethality. I had emerged onto a Navy frigate, a patrol vessel running along the edge of the sector, far from any established shipping lanes. They had detected the warp anomaly I represented and come to investigate, expecting a daemon or a corruption requiring immediate purging. What they found instead was a naked man covered in wounds that did not bleed, speaking a name they had never heard, begging them to confirm that he was real. The interrogation lasted for weeks. Inquisitorial representatives were summoned, psychers brought in to scan my mind, tech priests tasked with searching databases for any record of the Emperor's burden or its crew. They found nothing. The ship had been lost for 17 years, they told me. 17 years in real space since the Emperor's burden had translated and never emerged. Everyone aboard had been declared dead, their names added to the Imperium's endless lists of souls consumed by the warp's hungry depths. I had aged approximately 3 days. They questioned me about what I had experienced, about the entity, about the door. I told them everything, or tried to. The words kept slipping away, the memories refusing to hold their shapes, the experiences dissolving into impressions that language could not capture. The psychers confirmed that something had touched me, that I carried traces of exposure to an intelligence they could not fully identify, but they found no evidence of corruption, no taint of chaos, no mark of the ruinous powers. The entity was not a demon. It was not a god. It was something else entirely, something the Inquisition had no category for, something that had been waiting in the warp for 10,000 years and would wait 10,000 more. They released me eventually. Not because they believed I was innocent, but because they could not find anything to charge me with. My name was added to a watch list. My movements were noted by agents I was not supposed to be able to identify. I was assigned to menial labor aboard an orbital station, processing cargo manifests, maintaining records, doing the same work I had done before, but in a location where my potential contamination could be more easily contained. I am still here. I am still working. I am still alone, though not in the same way I was before. The door still appears sometimes, in corners of my quarters, in the edges of cargo bays, in the reflections of cogitator screens when the light hits them at certain angles. The voices behind it still call my name, still promise me communion, still offer me an end to the loneliness that has defined my existence. The entity has not forgotten me. It waits with the patience of something that has already waited 10,000 years and will wait 10,000 more. But I have learned something in the time since my escape. I have learned that loneliness is not just an absence to be filled. It is a space that can be inhabited. It is a territory that can be explored. It is a condition that can be transformed from prison into sanctuary, if you are willing to do the work of understanding why you built those walls in the first place. I have begun to make connections, small ones, tentative ones, a brief conversation with a fellow cargo handler, a shared meal in the station's commissary, a joke exchanged with a maintenance technician. These moments are fragile, easily broken, nothing like the cosmic communion the entity offered, but they are real in a way the door's promises never were. They require vulnerability. They require risk. They require me to be present with another person instead of hiding behind the comfortable armor of isolation. I do not know if I will ever be fully human again. I do not know if the entity's touch has changed me in ways that have not yet become apparent. I do not know if the door will one day appear and I will be too tired, too weak, too broken to resist its promises. But I know what I saw on the other side. I know what communion really means in the entity's realm. I know what happens to souls who accept the offer, who step through the door, who finally end their loneliness by dissolving into something that is more alone than any individual could ever be. And I know that the light I found in the abyss, the small stubborn flame of refusal that guided me home, is still burning in my chest. It is dimmer some days than others. It flickers when the door appears, when the voices call, when the weight of 17 years of loss presses against my fragile reconstruction of self. But it has not gone out. That is what it is like to be trapped in the warp alone. It is not the horror stories, not the demon attacks, not the reality-breaking encounters with beings of impossible power. Those things happen, yes, and they are terrible beyond description. But the true trap of the warp is subtler than that. The true trap is the offer of connection to someone who has spent their life avoiding it. The true trap is the promise of belonging to someone who has never believed they could belong anywhere. The true trap is a door that opens onto everything you have ever wanted, offered by something that will consume you the moment you accept. I walked away from that door. I do not know if I will always be strong enough to walk away. I do not know if the entity will eventually wear me down, if the loneliness will eventually become too much, if the voices will eventually say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. But for now, in this moment, I am still here. I am still myself. I am still alone in a way that leaves room for becoming something else. And the door, waiting in the corner of my vision, has not yet opened on its own. That is all I can tell you. That is all I know. That is what it is like to be trapped in the warp alone, and to find, against all odds, a way back out. The light in my chest flickers, the door in the corner waits, and I keep choosing, moment by moment, to remain on this side.